San Salvador, El Salvador fathered my brown, and so I was born in the capital that salutes the Pacific, the mother of so many brown rivers, lakes, ponds that held hands with volcanic rocks that tumbled brown, burned the soil brown, and browned the country in civil brown turmoil in the 1970s when my family left to New England, where factories, my mother's sewing machine, and my father's spray paint machine were brown, and I first attended John Winthrop Elementary School, a school full of browns, a separate but equal type of brown that was not El Salvador brown, but a desperate to move out of the project brown, and so my parents poured their wages into tuition for a private middle school classroom where I was the only brown, and I was taught to make my language a less subtle brown, so that by the time I attended New London High School, which had shades of Puerto Rican brown and tints of Latin American brown, I had shed so much brown that I was accused of not being enough brown, but I figured I knew the roots of my brown and felt comfortable enough with my brown, even if I was losing some of my Spanish brown. And I continued to lose it too, not because I wanted to, but because most of the brown at the college I attended was Republican brown. We spoke a different dialect of brown. And by the end of my 4 years, my Spanish brown had faded so much that it became an anglicized Spanish brown, and I was awarded the college's Excellence in English Award, which I was pretty sure had never been given to a graduating brown. And when they said this year's recipient is Jose Rosales Brown, I could have sworn I saw hundreds of people scrape their ears in an attempt to fix whatever was making them hear brown. And after graduating, I figured I'd get a job teaching English even if I was brown, but at an interview for an English teaching position at a small boarding school, a headmaster told me if I was serious about getting a job, I'd teach Spanish brown because there's such a shortage of Spanish browns, to which I said, thank you, headmaster, but I just assumed I'd teach Spanish brown. And when his eyes said, thank you, Mr. Brown, but unless you're willing to teach Spanish brown, I won't have a job for you, Mr. Brown, I changed my mind and I did what I had to, even if my first language was no longer Spanish brown. And I taught there until one brown day in the middle of the school year, and I just had to ask him, I know you hired me for something else, but someday can I teach English here, even if I am brown? And his office store replied with, if you didn't want to teach Spanish brown, maybe you shouldn't have been brown, which told me it was time for me to leave that master and get my master's, and I decided to attend, what else? It was Ivy League brown. You want to talk about a different shade of brown? That was like a culture shock brown. I mean, this is a bad novella. I'd never seen this before, kind of brown. And there was so many educated liberal browns. I thought that there had been some kind of going out of business clearance sale on opponents brown. Not that the majority was brown, but I just wasn't too used to associating the college experience with brown. So even a little bit of brown was enough to make me think that colleges were turning somewhat brown. And while at Brown, I students taught at Providence's Hope High School, which had many browns. So I wanted very badly for my students to recognize my brown and say, if he's that brown and he's brown, there's hope for us young browns. They just thought I was Brown University brown, not inner city brown. Students couldn't see themselves in my brown, and so unaccustomed were they to seeing any shade of brown in front of their class, so they thought it was impossible that I could be raised brown. But I didn't let that get me too much down, and when I graduated from Brown, I became a brown, a brown squared, a brown times brown, which for some people, teachers even, only meant that I was Ivy League brown because I am brown, which meant me wanting to point to brown graduates who were brown because their parents or grandparents were brown, making them legacy browns. Brown's cute. And I continued my schooling at the University of Rhode Island and worked toward my PhD because of, not in spite of being brown, and I studied literature that was brown because growing up I had been assigned stories like Young Goodman Brown, but I had never been assigned to a book by a brown author, which never made sense to me because I just knew that in all the years of that Browns had been in the U.S., even in the part that was brown before the U.S. became the U.S., Browns had to have something to say, even if it wasn't about being brown. And while I worked on my brown dissertation, I taught English at Three Rivers Community College, which had quite a few browns, so many of them juggled coursework with family and jobs and being brown, that it was tough for them to one day say I have a college degree even though I'm brown, which made me appreciate being educated and being brown, and I became ABD, a brown doctor, and probably became URI's first English PhD brown because which isn't that big a deal because in higher education, if you're brown, you can lay claim to being the first this and that as brown. And that's why when I tell people that I'm a professor of English, every once in a while someone says something like, Dr. Brown, you must teach a different type of English that has to have some kind of brown. Maybe you teach second language brown English or remedial brown English or developmental English for the brown, because after all, you're brown. But it matters none to me, master of my own brownness to me, because even on the coldest, snowiest day in Connecticut, even when it seems I've been brown beaten, I can still feel the power of my own brown, brown like a brown beat the board of bed, brown like a brown trunk of a brown tree that's been whacked and whacked and whacked and whacked and whacked and whacked and whacked until it's become nothing but a strong brown wooden frame that holds a brown diploma high up in the air, telling the world I'm educated and I'm brown.